The course of World War II was governed by massive air power from the very start, and the heavy bomber became the dominant weapon in a new form of total war. The most potent Allied bomber in the European conflict was the British Lancaster.
It was an aircraft that would see you through.
Flying at night, Lancasters pounded the major cities of Nazi Germany into a mass of twisted metal and smoking rubble.
It was truly a wonderful airplane and a major contributor to the victory in the Second World War.
The cost was enormous. Thousands died on the ground and in the air. Of more than 7,000 Lancasters built, almost half were lost. Using rare color film and detailed reenactments, Battle Stations follows the struggle to design and build Britain's most successful bomber, and joins a Lancaster crew on their deadly mission, a night raid deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The bomber first appeared during World War I. These fragile biplanes, made of wood and canvas, were unable to carry heavy bomb loads or do much damage, but they left a deep impression on the military designers and planners. During the 1920s and early 1930s, European governments became convinced that bombers would dominate any future war. Yet Britain was slow to modernize its air force, and many of its aircraft designs were obsolete before they left the drawing board. Germany did not make the same mistake. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power, determined to create a new German superstate, the Third Reich. He at once began a huge rearmament program. Hitler created a modern air force, the Luftwaffe. Its chief weapon was to be the bomber. Within a few short years, Germany was openly preparing for war. The British government at last realized the impending danger and launched an urgent program to re-equip the Royal Air Force. They turned to aircraft designers like Roy Chadwick. He had joined the Avro Company in 1911 as a draftsman and steadily worked his way to the top. Chadwick was a visionary who combined the precision of an engineer with the eye of an artist.
He was tall and slender, and I remember him in dark overcoats when in his young days with a white silk scarf he would have knotted. He had big brown eyes and an olive face and dark hair, and he was elegant. He liked kind of elegant things, and I think that is translated into his machines.
Roy Chadwick had a passion for his work and never stopped worrying about how to improve his designs.
It was winter, and the curtains would be drawn. He was sitting in the room after his evening meal, just quietly there, with the Manchester Evening News. And he would fold it over, and I'd see he'd do the crossword puzzle. And then I might go to say goodnight, Daddy, and give him a kiss. And I'd see all round the edges of the Manchester Evening News, all the calculations. He was doing two things at once.
In 1936, the Air Ministry invited designs for a new medium-range bomber. The ministry wanted an aircraft which could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs, fly round trips of 2,000 miles, and do it all with only 2 engines. It was a very tall order, which could have defeated a lesser talent, but Roy Chadwick rose to the challenge.
I asked him once, how do you design an aeroplane, Daddy? And he said, well, I think of all the parts first and then I sit down to do the design.
Chadwick designed his bomber around a massively strong central section in the shape of a cross. It was formed by the 2 wing spars bolted at right angles to a pair of girders, forming the roof of a huge bomb bay. After months of painstaking work, the plans were ready. Every single component had been designed and drawn, down to the last nut and bolt. Roy Chadwick named his bomber in honor of Avro's hometown, Manchester. In the summer of 1937, the Air Ministry placed an urgent order for 200 Manchesters, even though the prototype had not yet been tested. It was a huge gamble, but everybody now expected a war. It was simply a matter of when. A growing mood of panic swept the country. Londoners began building air raid shelters. Gas masks were issued, and the public were instructed on what to do.
If you are provided with a steel shelter and have not erected it, do so at once. Always keep your gas mask handy in the house. When you hear the warning signals, take cover at once.
In September 1939, the fragile peace collapsed. Britain was at war with Germany. As Europe was overrun, cities like Warsaw and Rotterdam were devastated by German bombers. Then in September 1940, Hitler finally unleashed his bombers on London. The Blitz had begun, and Londoners found themselves in the front line.
There was a lot of shrapnel coming down, pitter-pattering on the roof and all that kind of thing, and it was scary. I mean, incendiary bombs dropped in our garden. My best pal was there with us at the time, and it was then that we decided we wanted to join up. That particular night, actually.
The German attack soon spread to other British cities. In one devastating raid, the centre of Coventry was almost completely wiped out. The aim was to terrify and demoralize the civilian population into accepting defeat. The effect was to unite them in a single-minded quest for revenge, and that meant bombing German cities.
I used to come home on leave and see all the people going down into the underground shelters in London, you know, sleeping down there night after night, and I used to think to myself, you know, this is terrible. But I used to get a sense of pride then. Well, thank God we're hitting back.
More bombers was the slogan. Bombers began to appear, not in dozens, but in hundreds. And Germany began to get what was coming to her. For the first time, we carried the war into the Nazi camp.
But in the early stages of the war, the bombing campaign caused little damage. Most of the aircraft were too small to carry an effective bomb load. And without electronic navigation equipment, the bomber crews often missed their targets by many miles.
Bomber Command was simply incapable of hitting any targets, much less precision targets. They probably killed more cows and blew up more trees and damaging any portion of the German landscape that mattered. They thought that they were waging a precision bombing campaign. They simply weren't.
If the bombing campaign was to be effective, Britain urgently needed two things: accurate navigation aids and an effective, long-range heavy bomber.
Of considerable aid to the Royal Air Force is the big twin-engine bomber known as the Manchester. They carry a heavy bomb load at a high speed, thanks to the Rolls-Royce Vulture engines, and they have a powerful defensive armament.
Hopes were high as Roy Chadwick's Manchester finally entered service with Bomber Command. But behind the brave words, the truth was much less encouraging. Although Chadwick's airframe design was sound, the problem lay with the complex and unreliable Vulture engines, which struggled to get airborne with a full bomb load and regularly failed in mid-flight.
It just did not work. and they couldn't get the height and anything, and it was a horrible plane.
The official verdict was finally delivered from the Air Ministry. Avro would complete the initial order for 200 Manchesters and then switch to building a rival design. For Roy Chadwick, it was a bitter blow. But he would not be beaten. He knew that his bomber could still be a winner. Somehow he had to prove it, and prove it fast. The decision by the British Air Ministry to abandon production of the Avro Manchester bomber forced Roy Chadwick to rethink his design. He saw that what it needed was a set of bigger wings and a lot more power. He decided to remove the 2 unreliable Vulture engines in favor of 4 Merlin engines. The Merlin was an outstanding design, which already powered the famous Spitfire and Hurricane fighters of the RAF. After persuading the Air Ministry to give him one last chance, Chadwick went back to the drawing board.
In the tracing office, they work with pencil and ruler. But without this work, the giant bomber could not begin to take shape.
He told everybody, keep it simple. He always said, if it looks right, it is right.
The enlarged wings and their new engines were fitted. Extra fuel tanks were installed, and the finished aircraft was rolled out into the light of day.
He said to me this day, would you like to come with me? We're going to test a new machine. Of course I went. Captain Sam Brown, the test pilot, took it up. It was wonderful to see it overhead. And he manoeuvred it around, all banking and turning. I'd never seen such a big machine. And then he came back and landed, and everybody at one accord rushed across the field, and someone called up to him, "How'd it go, Sam?" And he said, "Oh, it was marvellous. So light on the controls, so easy to handle." We got back into the car and were driving home. And I remember actually saying to my father, "Well, Daddy, you must be very pleased." And he said, "Well, I am, darling, but in this business, no one can afford to rest on their laurels."
The flight certificate, duly signed by Roy Chadwick, carried a new name for the test aircraft, the Lancaster. The machine suddenly looked and felt right. The problems that had plagued the Manchester were quickly forgotten as the glowing reports of the test pilots confirmed Roy Chadwick's faith in his design.
This is the weapon upon which the Allies based tremendous hopes. To the people who built the Lancasters, each doing his own task to the best of his ability, their success came as no surprise.
Soon, the Lancaster bomber would become a household name. For one man, it would become the key to victory. Early in 1942, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Britain's Bomber Command. He was an aggressive leader, with a single-minded determination to destroy the German war machine.
Press home your attack. If you individually succeed, you will have delivered the most devastating blow against the very vitals of the enemy. Let him have it right on the chin. Send that message to all groups and stations.
Bomber Harris did a marvellous job. He was brought in when Bomber Command was at a real low ebb.
Harris knew that the accurate bombing of strategic targets was almost impossible. In a controversial decision, he supported plans to adopt the German policy of area bombing. Like Hitler's Luftwaffe, the RAF would saturate major centers of population with bombs, and its chief weapon, which Harris called the Shining Sword in the hands of Bomber Command, would be the Lancaster.
And here's the bomb rack, which can open up with 8 tons of trouble for Hitler. It's 33 feet long. When it's released its load, another 2 or 3 acres of Germany will never be the same again.
The Lancaster soon became the undisputed heavyweight champion of the British bomber force. As it proved its worth in combat, fresh orders poured into the Avro factories.
We got a new aircraft, and on the side it was HWH, and at that time there was a film called Hell's a Poppin'. Right, OK lads, this is Hell's a Poppin'. So I got some yellow paint, I climbed onto the wing and I painted Hell's a Poppin' all the way up. Hell's a Poppin' it was. It was a lucky aircraft for us.
For many, the Lancaster quickly became far more than just a machine. It was alive, and to its all-male crew, the Lanc was definitely a lady.
It was love at first sight. There she was, and she was standing up on these long legs, and a black beauty. Funnily enough, I didn't feel that there was any rivalry with the rest of the crew, you know. I felt she was my girlfriend, and we all felt that it was our girlfriend, you know.
It took a crew of 7 to fly a Lancaster. The pilot, flight engineer, navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, and 2 gunners.
The most forward position was the bomb aimer, who was lying down in the bomb position. And if necessary, he manned the front gun. And the skipper was on the port side. Next to him was the flight engineer's position. Then you had the curtains, and the navigator sat behind those, so he could have his lights on his charts. The wireless operator was behind him. And then you went back over the main spar, and then you had the mid-upper gunner, and then you had the tail gunner. If any one of you didn't do your job, well, that was it. The whole lot of you went.
You live and sleep and eat together. You go out together. They rely on you and you rely on them.
The pilot in Bomber Command was always the skipper, irrespective of rank. And even if the group captain, the CO of the squadron, flew with me, I was in charge.
You weren't just a crew of 7. You'd got the ground crew. The ground crew were the boys who got that aircraft so they would bring you back. And we had a terrific ground crew we had. We'd do anything for them, and they'd do anything for us.
The ground staff, who watched and waited back at base, played a vital supporting role as the bomber crews risked their lives over enemy territory. In the control tower, they anxiously plotted the course of each raid. They knew only too well that with every Lancaster posted as missing, another 7 men would not be coming back that night.
The Avro Lancaster, most powerful and efficient bomber in the world, and one of the most important war-winning weapons yet devised by the United Nations. The Lancaster is a name that is writing war history.
Although Chadwick had designed the Lancaster for mass production, it was still a monumental task. Each aircraft contained some 55,000 separate parts, involving roughly 500,000 engineering operations.
He had designed the Lancaster in 5 sections so that it could be made in all the different factories and then brought together. And with this simplification, they were able to put it together quickly and simply, and so much so that at the height, I think it was 1943, 150 Lancasters a month were being produced.
Meet a few of the ordinary, hard-working people devoted to this important task. Angela Roberts, a capstan operator. Maisie Rafferty at a press. Dobson Hind and his mate, Joan Evans, riveting. Every pilot of a Lancaster is confident that he's handling an aircraft into which has gone not only superb designing, but the proud craftsmanship of an experienced army of workers.
It's everything you wanted in a heavy bomber. It had got the strength, the speed, the manoeuvrability. Its weight carrying capacity was out of this world.
It took eventually 6 tons more than it had been designed for. Sir Arthur Harris said it was the camel that never knew the last straw.
In our training, we used to cut 2 engines on one side, and you could stand the Lancaster on its wingtip with 2 engines cut on one side. Marvellous aircraft.
I think the Lancaster was the finest bomber in the European theater of operations. It was truly a wonderful airplane and a major contributor to the victory in the Second World War.
By 1943, the Allies were equipped with enough heavy bombers to launch an all-out offensive against Nazi Germany. It was to be a 24-hour round-the-clock operation. The Americans bombing by day, the British by night. Electronic navigation systems were introduced, and the bombing became more accurate. Radio direction finders and radar scanners were installed in selected aircraft, and their hand-picked crews were given special training as pathfinders. It all came together at the end of July 1943, when a series of heavy raids on the city of Hamburg demonstrated the devastating effect of area bombing. Thousands died in the inferno as huge areas of the city were utterly destroyed. Area bombing had not broken the British resolve to fight, but Arthur Harris still remained firmly convinced that this was the only way to defeat Nazi Germany. They sowed the wind, he said. Now they are going to reap the whirlwind. As the scale of the operation steadily increased, so did the weight of bombs falling on Germany.
One of the great contributions of the Lancaster in the Second World War is its capacity to carry extraordinarily large bombs. The power of those weapons were such, when combined with accuracy, that you could really wreck big targets.
For 12 months, British scientists were working day and night on one of the most remarkable engineering feats of the war, the 12,000-pounder. And here it is, over 5.5 tons of concentrated destruction, the biggest bomb yet known in air warfare.
Lancasters eventually carried no less than 22,000 pounds, the 10-ton Grand Slam bomb. But most raids involved more conventional loads. The crews knew in advance what bombs they would be carrying. What remained a mystery was that night's intended target. One clue was the fuel load.
If they said, oh, it's only 1150 gallons, you think, it's a short one. But normally it was 2154, that was full tanks. So that was a long one.
As dusk was falling, the air crews would go to their briefing. Only then would their target be revealed.
When you entered, of course, there was a big curtain up over the whole map of Europe, you see. And that curtain was only drawn back when the CO walked in to tell you what the target was for that particular night.
There'd be a huge wall map with a piece of ribbon marking the route that you'd be taking to the target. The first thing everybody looked at was where the end of the ribbon was.
You now know precisely the next item on that list. Cross it off.
Now the tension began steadily mounting as 0 hour approached.
I used to go to Naffy and always write my last letter. Obviously you can't post it, and it goes in your locker, and if you shouldn't return, that letter would be taken out of your locker and sent to the family.
The average number of ops, or missions, or whatever you want to call them, we call them ops, was 7.5. After you did over 7.5, you were living on somebody else's borrowed time. You had 1 week's leave every 6. There was a block of 6 of you, and anybody on that got the chop or didn't come back. Their name was taken off the list. Everybody moves up one underneath. The new crew go to the bottom. So sometimes, in a heavy time, You would go 3 weeks and you'd get another week's leave because 3 of the bods above you got the chop.
A great friend of mine, Sergeant Ellsworthy, he was on his 28th trip and he didn't come back.
Ellsworthy's fiancée had already lost a previous boyfriend, who had also been a pilot. Now she turned to Laurie for consolation, and the friendship soon blossomed into a romance. But Laurie's superstitious crew did not approve of the match.
So I had to drop her. The crew said, "You will drop her, Skip." She was a jinx. Poor girl. Very nice looking girl too.
But for the skipper of a Lancaster, in love as in war, the welfare of his crew always came first. They had to believe their luck would hold as they set off for Germany.
You were at the beginning of an adventure. You were at the beginning of something dangerous. You were at the beginning of fear, and you would feel fear. And anyone who said they didn't feel fear were liars or nuts.
As the Lancaster crews were driven out to their aircraft, each man knew only too well how dangerous their mission was. Superstition and ritual could not guarantee a safe return. But then again, perhaps they could.
I always wore a green scarf with little Chinese markings on them, which my sister had given me. She says, "You might need this scarf."
I got married 3 days before D-Day. I had a silk stocking from the wife. I tied that round my neck. I never took that silk stocking off until I'd finished ours. I showered with it, I did everything. It was my lucky charm, was that silk stocking.
One or two of the crews from the squadron were given dolls by a young girl who used to knit them as lucky mascots.
I carried that doll on all the trips I did. I swear blind that that mascot brought me back.
You talk about the smell of an aircraft. It had that smell of comfort, and that puts it all in one word. That was home from home.
Once you get into your seat, of course, you check all your various meters, pumps, gauges. Once we're all satisfied that everything's in working order, we get the order to move, and then we move off. You have to synchronise your engines, but once you have them synchronised, they just purred. Music to the ears.
The sound of 4 Merlins is something which is beautiful.
Weighed down with bombs and fuel, the heavy bombers would line up, waiting their turn to thunder down the runway and take to the air.
This is the moment of no return. This is where the decision's been made. This is where you're in her world, and suddenly it all seems to happen. You've got a full bomb bay, and you've got full power, and suddenly she's let go, you know. I mean, that moment, it's unbelievable. And you roar down the runway, and all you can hear is the noise, and it's a beautiful noise. You've got 1,400 yards to lift about 14,000 pounds. It starts to seem that she's going to lose the game against gravity. But just after halfway, you feel that gentle bounce, and then another gentle bounce. And suddenly, boom, and you're weightless, and you're airborne. It's moments like that she tells you what she's all about. And she's just magnificent, just magnificent. She, not it, is magnificent. She.
And now, as our Lancaster takes to its element, think again of the importance of every item in its construction. The successful accomplishment of the job it has been assigned to may depend on one of the smallest parts. The lives of its crew, too.
You felt safe in a Lanc somehow. When all around you's going mad, you're somewhere safe. You always thought, if anything happens, it'll happen to the other bloke, not to you.
We were going to do a full tour. We weren't going to get shot down. That happened to other people. We weren't going to get shot down, no.
It's always somebody else that gets it, never you, until you get it.
As the bomber formation reached the enemy coast, the mission entered its most dangerous phase. Ahead lay the batteries of deadly anti-aircraft guns and the night fighters of the Luftwaffe. But the only sound that reached the crew members was the reassuring drone of the Merlin engines.
You had this sort of rhythmic sound of the Merlins there, you know, and somehow that was warm and comforting. And you weren't thinking then, oh, will we ever get there and get back again? Because you had utter confidence in her.
You just felt we're going into it now, and everybody alert. I used to pass orders round. Gunners, keep your eyes skinned.
Isolated in his turret, the rear gunner had barely enough room to move. Most attacks came from the rear, and he was often the first casualty.
It was a vulnerable position, I can't deny that, but not one you could shy away from. That's the job you were there to do, and you did it.
Tail-in Charlie, as we called him, he was the fall guy. I think there were more casualties with rear gunners than any of the other crew members.
As they reached the target, the bombers had to fly through a dense barrage of exploding shells from the German flak batteries.
I would say it takes a lot to make me afraid, but I was scared. Really scared at times. Frightened to death. My God, this is it. This is my time coming. I've only had 19 years. I'm on the chop.
You are frightened, you are scared, and you just hope that you will come back.
You had a lot of other things to think about than fear. And I must say that over the target, it was exciting. And excitement was over fear then.
Bombing says, right, skipper, target's in sight, I'm ready for the bombing run. And then it's all quiet in the aircraft because he is in sole charge and you do exactly what he says.
You actually go out there to hit a target. The fact that civilians may be killed, you've got to blank that out. The most important thing was to get the correct wind speed and direction.
It's sheer hell, anything from about 15 to 30 seconds. Seems like 15 to 30 hours.
And under your breath you're saying, for God's sake, drop the ruddy things.
Get rid of these bombs now. Just want to get them away.
Bomb's gone.
You just go up like this. It's amazing. I mean, you go up like from one floor to the 10th floor in the car park. You vroom.
And as soon as he says, bomb's gone, I throw the aircraft over and get the hell out of there.
The first thing is to hang on for grim death because he's corkscrewing like this, you see.
At last, they could take evasive action to avoid the fighters and head for home.
You'd see a flash, 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 flash. Oh, quite clearly. And it's remarkable how fast an explosion travels. It goes out very, very quickly, 100 yards, 200 yards each way.
Going back, because I was at the back, I always felt if somebody wanted to grab you, in the darkness, they want to grab you back for what you'd done.
Back in England, other hands were reaching out. willing the Lancasters to return to the safety of their home base.
They were so close to us that they were almost brothers as well. They wanted us to come back. Because they have this long piece of string and they would let you go, they'd bring you back again, you know. So you were tied to them.
But for the pilot and his crew, the long night was not over yet. German fighters still prowled the skies over Europe, waiting for the moment to attack. And the bombers were still a very long way from home.
The first bombers have dropped their incendiaries and ringed the target. Each speck of light a blazing German building. Easy enough to realize the catastrophe, the concentrated chaos that is overwhelming the city below.
As they set course for home, the crew could not let down their guard for a second. German night fighters continued to attack the bombers relentlessly all the way across occupied Europe.
You see the flames and you watch the parachutes coming out. I can remember my skipper used to shout at us and say, "Pay attention, this could be you next."
The gunner suddenly called out, "There's a Ju-88 coming in, skipper." I said, "Okay, give me your orders as soon as you can, what to do." He's in charge then. And he said, "Prepare to port, prepare to dive port, prepare to dive port, prepare to dive..." And as he said that, we were hit. And he also fired at that time. As I put the aircraft over to go port down, I saw the tracer go underneath me. Then I went into a screaming dive to port, and at the same time, of course, there were screams from the rear gunner and the mid-upper gunner. They'd both been hit. I said to the flight engineer, "Bill, give me a hand with this control column." Eventually, I got out of the dive. I was down to about 6,000 feet then, and of course I relaxed and whipped over again into another dive, you see. It's the same way. We pulled out at about 2,000 feet, and immediately I saw a bit of cloud and I dived into it.
The fighter had vanished, but the Lancaster was badly damaged and almost impossible to control. Part of the wing was missing. The fuselage was riddled with holes, and both gunners were seriously wounded.
I asked my navigator to set a course. I said, "I can't turn to starboard at all," because I had full right rudder on and full control column like this. And that's how we were flying back. All the time I was drifting slowly to port.
After 2 hours of fighting with the controls, they reached the English coast and prepared for an emergency landing.
The scaring part was, are the wheels going to come down? Because we didn't know whether the hydraulics were working, you see. And it was then I said to the crew, "If any of you want to jump now," the gunners are staying with me. They had no choice. They said, "Don't worry, Skip. We know we're staying with you." I thought the best thing to do so she doesn't flip over is to land at a faster speed. You just sat back and thought, you know, my godfathers, we've done it.
You get out and you pat it and say, "Thanks." Right, you'll say a piece of metal's lifeless. It is lifeless. But when it's put together with lots of other pieces of metal as a lank, it's alive. It's just asleep, waiting for the next night.
But the Lancaster was not immortal, and its next trip could always prove to be its last, as it was for so many crew members. The odds of them surviving a full tour of 30 operations were very low.
You go to bed, and then when you wake up, you find that the opposite beds 7 are empty, and you may see the adjutant coming in emptying the lockers, and you know then that that particular crew didn't make it back.
We just didn't see them again, and you saw these empty bunks. Well, they are. And then we all lost friends, perhaps on other squadrons. I lost 2 very good friends. I often miss them.
50% of bomber aircrew were killed. And if you add the training accidents and people who lost training, it works out roughly about 6 out of every 10.
And in Germany, the cost was even higher. Hundreds of thousands were killed or made homeless, as the nation which had once seemed invincible was steadily reduced to rubble.
No matter how messy the bomber offensive was, it was absolutely essential portion of winning of the war. Without the strategic bombing offensive, one can project an Allied victory, but maybe at the cost of another 2 or 3 million lives of Allied soldiers and perhaps the war continuing into 1946.
But after the war, the destruction of Germany's cities became a controversial issue, and an episode which many preferred to forget. Today, there are few memorials to the men of Bomber Command.
As far as I'm concerned, we had every right to bomb these places. In view of what Hitler not only had done to Britain, what he'd done to Warsaw, Rotterdam, well, wherever he invaded, they went in and destroyed everything they could.
After the war was finished, we used to go on trips to have a look at the damage that was done, you know, Cologne and all those places. Much the same as we suffered over in this country, obviously. But even then, that you looked at it and you thought, was all that necessary? Was there not another way of sorting this out?
But Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris had no doubts about the bombing policy, or about which aircraft had made it possible. Writing to Roy Chadwick, he said, "Without your genius and your effort, we would not have prevailed. The Lancaster was the greatest single factor in winning the war."
We've always got to have a designer before we can have a pilot. The man who contributes something like the Lancaster. That's an enormous thing. And that must be the job satisfaction to end all job satisfactions, mustn't it? And that lives forever. My young nephews don't say, my uncle was in the Air Force, they say, my uncle was on Lancs. That's Roy's tribute.
But the Lancaster could never have played its part in the victory without the thousands of brave young men who fought and died in the skies over Germany.
There's a hell of a lot of lads who've paid for my privilege to still be alive today. A lot of young men have paid the price, the ultimate sacrifice, so that I've got children, I've got grandchildren. I'm very, very lucky. I really am very, very lucky.